Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's live broadcast, The Key to Clinical Trial Success, Patient Tokenization. My name is Andy Studna, Associate Editor for Applied Clinical Trials, and I will be your moderator for today's event. We are pleased to bring you this webcast presented by Applied Clinical Trials and sponsored by Komodo and Datavant. I'd like to share a statement from our sponsors before we begin. Komodo Health is a healthcare technology company creating the new standard for real-world data and analytics through its platform, which enables real-time, accurate, and actionable insight into the treatment, diagnosis, costs, and outcomes journeys of millions of patients across the U.S. We believe that the only way to effectively close gaps in care, address unmet patient needs, and streamline physician engagement is through a deep, nuanced understanding of the real-world patient experience. Datavant's mission is to connect the world's health data to improve patient outcomes. Datavant works to reduce the friction of data sharing across the healthcare industry by building technology that protects the privacy of patients while supporting the linkage of patient health records across data sets. We have a few important announcements before we begin. This webcast is designed to be interactive, and we encourage you to ask questions during the event. You can submit questions by typing them in the Q&A box, which can be found at the bottom of the video player. You can enlarge the slide window by clicking on the small icon in the bottom right corner of the media player. The slides will advance automatically during the event. And if you have any technical problems viewing or hearing this presentation, please click on the question mark help widget in the top right of your presentation window. So thank you for joining us today, and I will now hand it over to Kwame to get us started.
Thank you so much, and great to see everyone. Thank you for taking the time for joining us today for an exciting conversation, really focused around the key to clinical trial success, the patient tokenization. When I checked on clinicaltrials.gov earlier this morning, we continue to see a wealth of clinical trial activity. And arguably over the past few years, the entire world has had a crash course on clinical trials. At the last count I saw, there were 64,000 clinical studies that are actively recruiting right now. So it continues to remain very, very high. And of those, based on historical benchmarks, around 70% of them are actually interventional studies, where we're really looking to bring new therapies to market. So there's a wealth of activity that's happening, and I'm really, really excited to unpack how we can drive a fair amount of success across the clinical trial landscape through tokenizing patient data. Here's the agenda we're going to run through today with you. We're going to go over some brief introductions of who we all are, and then really chat about Komodo Datavant and our partnership and how we're working to really connect disconnected healthcare data across the entire ecosystem to really surface new insights. And then we'll talk about some use cases and really bring this to life across the entire landscape. So with that, I'll jump into the introductions. As mentioned at the top, I am Kwame. I am the market strategy lead for clinical development at Komodo Health. I'm excited today to be joined by Ivy, who is our head of clinical development, RWA and HER at Komodo Health, as well as Ryan, who's a clinical trial solutions leader at Datavant. Before we jump into the specifics around healthcare data and the solutions we were able to offer today, I really wanted to emphasize the mission of Komodo Health. The mission of Komodo Health is to reduce the global burden of disease. And the way we really do this is by building software solutions that connect siloed healthcare data to create meaningful insights that can drive a lasting impact for patients. It is true that it starts with the data, but it doesn't really end with the data. It really is about harnessing that data through technology to surface insights, and then more importantly, leveraging those insights to drive for impact. But it does start with the data. And as I'm sure most of you have experienced, healthcare data is difficult, it's messy, and it's tricky. So with that, I'll pass it over to Ivy to really start to unpack some of that and share some light on some of the challenges with leveraging and accessing healthcare data. Ivy?
Thank you so much, Kwame, and thank you all for having me here today. Really excited to be joined by Ryan and Kwame discussing, how we can really leverage real-world data in the, real-world evidence space and also clinical trial space. So my name is Ivy. I lead our real-world evidence practice here at Komodo Health. I'm a doctor by background, prior to Komodo, I've done a lot of work on the payer and provider side with healthcare analytics, and then now really focused on building best-in-class software solutions to support everything across the value chain from R&D to commercialization. So historically, healthcare data has been really difficult to piece together, both from an operational perspective in terms of where it's stored, and then in terms of sharing between multiple parties, and then finally, how we're able to bring together disparate sources while maintaining patient privacy. And what that meant was that, for when we're collecting patient data before a trial, during a clinical trial, and then post-trial, all of that was compiled by different parties and ultimately rendered very difficult to use for meaningful insights as it relates to follow-up, tracking adverse events, and then also studying long-term effectiveness and safety for these clinical trials. So the way we think about it has really changed over time, where data connectivity now allows for us to access the longitudinal patient journeys for these patients, where recent advances in data connectivity and advanced analytics allow real-world data to be collected before, during, and after the trial. It will help us reduce uncertainties across the drug development lifecycle and really increase the focus on what treatments work and for whom in real clinical practice. So what we've done at Komodo, and also together with Datavant, is really thread the needle between historical, concurrent, and also post-trial data, where we're able to collect patient-level data in a HIPAA-compliant way and stitch that together over many, many years to really power 6 key use cases that you can see at the bottom over here. We're using real-world data linked to clinical trial data. You can use it to optimize protocols, study design, site selection, really understanding social determinants of health and where patients are being underserved in terms of access to clinical trials. And then, you can also build external control arms for rare disease and personalized medicine, and then really understanding which patients respond better to certain trials. And then ultimately, it's for long-term follow-up for safety and efficacy, and also, ensuring that we're able to serve an unmet need.
Awesome. So much is available and unlocked today because of this connectivity. So Ryan, I'll pass it over to you to really start to unlock a little bit more and unpack exactly how this connectivity is enabled through some of the technology that Datavant is able to bring to the market today.
Great. Thanks so much, Kwame. And thanks again for everyone for joining us. So I'm Ryan Moog from the Datavant Clinical Trials team. And I'll spend a couple of minutes here talking about the how. So I have no doubt that all of you attending today can absolutely get inherently the value of being able to merge together clinical trial data, mortality data, claims data, EHR data, genomics data. But the question that Datavant tries to answer together with our partners like Komodo Health is actually, how do we go enable that? And how do we do that in a way that maintains patient privacy? Historically, you absolutely would have had to have some type of patient identifier to be able to share data and connect data across different data silos. Then over the last couple of decades, this idea of probabilistic matching has emerged to be able to say, well, we think that this 33-year-old male over here is a lot like this 33-year-old male over in this other data set based on what we know. But in order to get data to be truly regulatory grade and for us to make great decisions and generate good evidence, we have to have a high precision of matching across those different data sources. Because the reality is, as we all painfully know, data are fragmented and they will likely continue to be fragmented for the foreseeable future and likely for the collective remainder of all of our careers. So what Datavant has done in order to enable this is we've tried to do 2 things really well. One thing is actually being able to generate essentially patient tokens or privacy preserving record locators, which you can think of as like a long alphanumeric code for a patient that does not in any way, shape, or form represent that patient. It's encrypted, it's one way, and it really essentially is looks like a randomized code for the non-technical folks on the phone that enables us to be able to link with other data sets which have also been tokenized. So we'll dig in on the next slide in terms of how this actually works. But the other thing Datavant had to do in order to enable this is actually create an ecosystem. We are a neutral, ubiquitous, we try and be frictionless partner with lots of different healthcare data providers, data generators, and then data aggregators and analytics experts like the folks at Komodo Health to be able to enable not just the generation of those tokens, because if you can't do anything with it, it's not tremendously valuable, but then once you unlock that entire ecosystem of the universe of real-world data providers that we're all aware of, that's where you really get to the exciting stuff, and you can bring together clinical trial data and real-world data and potentially multiple different sources of real-world data. So on the next slide here, I'll dig a little bit, go one click deeper into how this actually works. And you think about the trials that you're running today and the value of being able to link to real-world data. The first thing we have to do is actually generate a new patient token, that privacy-preserving record locator or set of tokens about a patient at the site. We can do that through a couple of different ways. We can work directly with e-consent and e-clinical providers you might work with. We can work directly with CROs. And we can also work directly with sites. It really becomes a question of who has the patient PII and who can actually generate that token out of the PII and then leave the PII behind. So then the token itself actually becomes that patient linkable component inside the clinical trial data. We've already done the other heavy lifting of actually generating tokens inside the universe of real-world data out there. But importantly, at no point in time are they actually the same tokens across those data sets. It's not just as simple as saying, well, patient 123 over here is the same as patient 123 over there. So then what Datavant also does is it provides software to be able to generate and drive those linkages, where ultimately then you, as a study sponsor, as a researcher, can have access to data, not just that you're collecting from ECRF and ePro that you'd normally have as part of the clinical development cycle, but that can also link it in, for example, with aggregated, validated claims data to be able to make assessments on, does this patient, what's that patient's medical history look like? What is their ongoing, what are their ongoing clinical encounters? What are they picking up from the pharmacy on an ongoing basis as well? So ultimately, Datavant is that neutral third party that can sit across the universe of different ecosystem members to generate a longitudinal data set, which provides a lot of detail in terms of what the patient journey really is.
Thanks so much for shedding some additional light and double, triple clicking into that, Ryan. I will pass it back over to you to also do the same, especially thinking through what's underneath the hood here at Komodo and how we can be a strategic partner to link some of this available data to with regards to some of the tokens that are coming through from Datavant.
Yeah, what Komodo Health does very, very well is in bringing best-in-class data sources together, whether it's administrative claims, enriched with EMR, omics, lab results, race and ethnicity. We're able to, link all of these different sources together using the Datavant token. At Komodo, we've created the most comprehensive healthcare map of the US, which tracks the longitudinal journeys of 330 million US lives. So where we see every single clinical encounter de-identified. And this technology, in conjunction with Datavant, connected to Komodo's healthcare map, has unlocked this capability where, first we can identify what are the necessary data sets required to be fit for purpose for that specific trial. Then we will run the Datavant software to generate these tokens using first name, last name, gender, date of birth, social security, et cetera, and then connect the clinical trial patients that are tokenized to these different data sources. And what Komodo will do is manage the linking, the ingestion, and the certification of this linked asset. So visually, what this looks like is, our customers, whether it's the CRO or the sponsor, will be able to generate these tokens and bring that into the Komodo environment. And Komodo, underpinned by this backbone of 330 million US lives, we will then, in addition to the claims data, bring in other relevant clinical features for that specific trial. And once we create that environment, it will be a very bespoke universe that's specific to your trial, and you will be able to then track all of the retrospective historical data points for those patients in your clinical trial, and even, prospectively, where we're continuously refreshing that data on a daily basis for you to capture these patients even after the clinical trial is complete.
Fantastic. Thanks for highlighting that, Ivy. So let's actually jump into some use cases right now to further bring this to life. And so Ryan, I'll pass it over to you to talk about two use cases that are really a bit more upstream in thinking through the life cycle across clinical development, and showing how this technology, the software, this data can really drive a lot of value in this space.
Great, thanks a lot, Kwame, again. And why I'm so excited about being able to talk to you all today is one of the questions we consistently get is, hey, this makes a lot of sense. Where and why and how and when do I actually enable these types of linkages? So we'll talk through, like Kwame said, a couple of different ones that we've seen out in the field where there's been a lot of interest that I think could jog everyone's train of thought in terms of where this could be useful for the protocols that you're running today. The first one here is an idea of actually using legacy trial data to be able to combine with things like claims data and EHR data to make even better assessments of the types of potential patients out there in the field who are available for clinical trials, and getting a more longitudinal picture of the types of cohorts of interest. So one of the questions we always get is, I have a universe of different clinical trials. I run 70 different trials a year. Which ones are a fit, and how do I, and maybe I've got this trial over here that isn't necessarily a fit for real world data linkage today. And what we encourage a lot of organizations to think through is, well, go ahead and tokenize the data on that trial today, because those trial data provide an enormous amount of insight for lots of different companies who consistently look back at legacy trial data, look at how patient recruitment went, adherence to the trial, how the follow-up periods were managed. And so one really interesting use case we've seen is, hey, use that legacy data, combine that data with deeper claims data to potentially pull in additional information about patients that you didn't think about at the time you were running that trial, that specific trial you're wanting to pull in for new insight, and really be able to get a really complete picture. And so as maybe you have an incremental additional trial or a new phase of a study, you're really empowered with really great detail of, here's everything that happened about the patient, even beyond the questions I might have been asking at the time I was running that first study.
Fantastic. Yeah, and it's so clear the amount of value that exists there in terms of being able to go back in time, quote unquote, and really understand or contextualize those patients' experiences and understand where they are today, and have that insight really drive thinking through new strategies and new trials right now. So it's fantastic. Next use case?
Absolutely. So that was a before the trial use case. The one that I think is really kind of the slam dunk use case is this idea of reducing the burden of long-term follow-up for a number of trials. We hear this consistently. I came prior to Datavant, I spent over a decade in the site IT world, and one thing that we heard consistently from sites were sponsors were asking a lot of me, surely this data exists somewhere else. Is there some type of way that I can fulfill my obligation to the patients and to the study without necessarily requiring additional data capture to be done? And so one interesting use case we've seen emerge is actually the ability to use data like claims in relative real time. And this is why having a great data partner like Komodo Health comes in handy, because you're not able just to look at a single cut of claims data from 4 years ago. You can look at a robust map of the patient's experience during the course of the trial, but then you get the ability to say, especially for large trials where that follow-up burden could be quite significant, to be able to say, hey, we now know that these patients in between their study visits might have had unplanned clinical encounters that were really important to track. Maybe, unfortunately, the patient expired, and this gives us some additional detail about that happened. Or in some cases, even if the site had a 360-degree view of the patient within their health system and within their region, the patient goes on work travel or on vacation and has another type of encounter that they didn't report back, it really gives you the ability to fill in all those missing gaps, so that then as you're trying to explain additional details about the trial, it really gives you the detail that was missing before, that the site couldn't have theoretically actually even captured.
Love it. Again, like you said, slam dunk here, and I fully agree. There's a lot of value here that could be unlocked for sure. So thanks for those two. I'll pass it over to you for two more use cases, and then we'll open up for some Q&A.
Sure. I think just to double click into Ryan's two use cases, much of the recent literature has focused on potential regulatory uses, product approvals in oncology or rare disease, and it's based on single-arm trials with external control arms. Many clinical trials on rare diseases are conducted with very, very few patients, and oftentimes that translates to insufficient statistical power, failed trials, screen failures, et cetera, or they're performed as single-arm trials that make it very, very difficult to compare against other therapeutic options without synthetic control methods. Similarly, in oncology, we're moving towards more personalized medicine. Really, certain therapeutics will be most efficacious for a well-determined small patient population who frequently have poor prognoses. So because of that, it's ethically and operationally useful to consider an external control arm using real-world data. And kind of the way to think about this would be reducing the number of patients that need to be enrolled, and also accelerating time for therapies to be brought to the market. So we've recently shared two press releases, one with Applied VR and another one with Intercept Pharmaceuticals. And in both situations, we were able to accelerate the timelines of the trials because of the controls that we were able to implement using real-world data. We reduced the number of patients that had to be enrolled and ultimately reduced the cost of the clinical trial. And we're happy to follow up with details in terms of how we can really execute on real-world data and where it really shines in terms of therapeutic areas, situations where it makes sense, and also the outcome of comparing the output from a clinical trial compared to real-world data.
Thanks, Ivy. And I think thematically through this all, it's pretty apparent that it's a combination of real-world data and that clinical trial-rich data that you are receiving and collecting during the study. It's a matter of a yes and versus either or, and both of these two can really coexist to really enable richer insights and as you've alluded to, accelerate timelines through development and ultimately get to more direct lasting impacts for patients sooner rather than later. All right, cool. So at this point, we want to open to Q&A, and I've already seen a few questions come through. And at the top of the call, we shared how best to open, or how best to submit your questions through the chat. So please do so. Andy, feel free to come on board if there's another reminder of how best to do that. But I can see some already coming through.
Of course, yep. So just before we get started on the Q&A, once again, a reminder to our audience how to submit the questions. You could submit them by typing them in the Q&A box, which can be found directly below the video player.
Awesome. Cool. So I will start at the top here. So thank you all for the questions that have already come through. So maybe, Ivy, I'll take this one to you. So it says there's a lot of work ongoing across the industry with regards to social determinants of health, diversity. You mentioned that. There's FDA's draft guidance on increasing diversity of clinical trial participants that was recently released earlier this year. Can you talk about how your solutions help support this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think at the core of this is ensuring that the patients in the clinical trial are representative of the population at hand. And what we've done at Komodo is we've been able to master this healthcare map of 330 million US patients, where we're capturing patients across all 50 states, across commercial, Medicare, Medicare Advantage, and Medicaid. And in addition to that, we're able to identify patients, based on socioeconomic status, and also bring in race and ethnicity to identify pockets where they're underserved, where they have a lack of access to clinical trials. And by highlighting those disparities, we are able to measure the impact and then take measures to address that. So, in terms of what we've been doing, we've been enriching our data set with additional features so sponsors can then see, exactly where their trials are underpenetrated and if there are, actions that they can take to really unblock those access issues for certain patients, or even just start recruiting in areas where they've historically not had sites.
Thank you for that, Ivy. Ryan, I'm going to go to you for this one. It seems like a triple click into data linking. So maybe a two-part question here for you.
Sure.
Is this technology or data restricted to the US? And then associated with that, can you explain the process of correctly linking the same patient's data when there are different tokens from different sources? Like, can you explain the secret sauce, the magic of Datavant's technology there?
Sure thing. So I'll start with the first one. So today, we only tokenize data in the US. That will likely change over the coming years as we do our own global expansion, as we think about data partners that operating outside the US. But today, everything we've talked about today is US centric. And one thing to think about there too is because of the just the different healthcare landscapes outside the US, there isn't the same type of real world data ecosystem everywhere. And so that's one thing we're continuing to think through. And I'm not sure if Ivy or Kwame, after I wrap up here, you may want to offer any other comments around Komodo's ability to operate outside the US as well. So as far as token generation, US centric today. In terms of how we ensure a high quality of match and linkage, because like the question implied and I shared earlier, different data providers, different trials will inherently have different tokens. They're all hashed and encrypted differently to ensure that we're not create an easily linkable data set without having to put the right HIPAA certification constraints around it. So the way that works is, number one, we actually generate multiple tokens per patient. That's a complexity we don't always highlight in a 50,000 foot slide, but the reality is different data partners, different types of sites, different types of trials will inherently have different ability to gather PII. Some trials and sites we've seen don't typically capture social security numbers. Some data sources won't. So we actually generate a multitude of tokens that are all based on different underlying PII. Could be first name, last name, sound-alikes, date of birth, address, as you can imagine, all those key pieces. And each one of those tokens, as they can be linked, have different levels of match precision, as you can imagine. So if you just had first name and last name, that's going to have a different level of specificity and precision than if you had first name, last name, social security number, date of birth, et cetera, et cetera. So ultimately what Datavant software does is it converts those two separate sets of tokens to a single convertible token so that ultimately that data set can exist with a single, basically patient code, if you will, that can be used to generate that single data set.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Ryan. Ryan, I'm going to stay on you. There's a couple questions here related to HIPAA and privacy. So can you provide some additional perspectives on how you maintain HIPAA compliance and patient privacy with this technology to close those out?
Yeah, I'll answer that. And actually, there's two kind of sub bullets I would have in there. One is we ensure, and Datavant takes the ability to encrypt and handle data appropriately extremely seriously. It is priority number one inside of our business. So number one is we have to focus on, as those tokens are generated and that encryption occurs and that hashing occurs, that's one directional. It can't be reversed in any way, shape, or form. And so we can ensure that ultimately that code is that alphanumeric code that we call a token it doesn't contain any type of PII. So that's kind of step one, is in how we've gained a high degree of comfort across the industry that a token's truly de-identified. The second step, though, which I think is even more important, but it isn't always front of mind, is once you actually create a linked data set, you have a new responsibility to ensure that you've certified that new linked data set actually does not newly re-identify a patient. So for example, and we see this all the time, especially in rare disease, where you might only have 8 or 9 patients. And once you apply a whole bunch of additional data that weren't otherwise collected, you create a much richer data set, which inherently makes it easier to re-identify those patients. So that's where, whether it's a statistical expert at Datavant, or whether it's your own or an academic you work with, ensuring that they actually have a seat at the table to help ensure that that new linked data set is certified as de-identified as well.
Thanks, Ryan. Ivy, I'll jump to you now. A question around the type, breadth, depth of real-world data that Komodo has access to. Is it longitudinal? Is it refreshed? Does it sway towards one specific therapeutic area? So there's a question to really unpack a little bit about what's underneath the hood here at Komodo. And then Ryan, I'll jump back to you with a question around patient consent, as to the extent to which you've seen challenges with patients consenting to this as part of trial execution. But to you first, Ivy.
Great. So as we mentioned, Komodo has access to a longitudinal healthcare map. The core of it is primarily medical claims and prescription claims, where we're working with over 150 payer complete data sets. And in addition to that, we bring in labs, for lab values, lab results. We bring in charge master data where we can see line item by line item in the inpatient setting. And then we can bring in EHR fields as well. So lab, charge master, EHR. There are other sources that we have been able to link to, namely first-party data sources that can be registry data, clinical trial data, patient hub data, specialty pharmacy data. All of these different data sets can be brought into the Komodo environment, where we will help with linking and also managing the certification of that linked asset. How often is this data refreshed? I'd say the lag is around 2 weeks to 2 months, and the level of overlap that we have with all of these different data sources is around 95%. It's really representative across all therapeutic areas. We are therapeutic area agnostic, so we can drill into very specific inclusion and exclusion criteria depending on the need. I wanted to go back to the question around privacy, where when we're bringing together these different data sets, all of this is de-identified on the Datavant token. And because we're using this Datavant token, they have the same token across all of these different data sets. We know we're following the same patient over time, even across these different data sets. And because all of this is de-identified, IRB approval is not required when we're doing research or even using this in this manner.
Thanks, Ivy. Brian, I'll jump back to you here on managing patient consent. To the extent you've seen customers, sponsors see this as maybe a hindrance or a barrier. Has this come up in terms of deploying this technology where, recruiting patients for a particular trial and they're saying, hey, we can also bring in some of this additional real-world data in a longitudinal manner? Has this come up in your experience as we've been deploying these?
Yeah, very appropriately, it comes up all the time. It's a great conversation to have. So how I typically respond to that is I would think about patient consent in one of 3 ways. One is we've had a handful of studies, especially as tokenization in clinical trials is really a new concept. We've gone from 0 to 60 pretty quickly at Datavant over the last few years. But there are a whole bunch of trials still out in the field today that don't necessarily have captured patient consent for tokenization. In those cases where perhaps maybe all the patients have already been enrolled, it's a large study, it would present a real difficulty to reach back out to those patients. We have worked with IRBs to ensure that tokenization and ultimately linkage to de-identified data sources can fall under non-human subjects research. Now that's always going to be at the call of the sponsor's IRB, and then obviously the sites who you might be requiring PII be shared from. But that's certainly one way to think about that. That being said, it's always going to be our preference, both as a company and then just as a healthcare consumer myself, that patients do have the ability to be educated on this, and it becomes a part of that consent conversation. So I mentioned that there were 3 ways to think about it. So the second and the third way to think about it is actually presenting patients with consent either in the general informed consent language for the trial, or what we've seen be really successful is as a follow-on consent, where in addition to the standard informed consent they're signing for the trial, they get a follow-on consent and education of, hey, we're also going to tokenize your data and link to real-world data sources. And that requires a different, in some cases, some more additional patient education, additional site education to make sure that they can appropriately have that conversation. But we've actually worked pretty extensively on that topic and produced things like patient education videos, both in English and in Spanish, to make sure that people are aware not just of what a token is, but also of what that real-world data ecosystem even looks like and why that exists.
Thanks, Ryan. Ivy, we'll throw this question back to you. So a question here around if there are any limits to what can be linked. So maybe we can chat through any limitations or considerations there, how we make sure we don't increase the re-identification risk when we're bringing in new novel data sets. So can you take that?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of limits to what is linked, as long as the data set is de-identified and tokenized on the Datavant token, we can link to it. But kind of what we do is, when you're bringing together all of these different data sources, you're adding information with every single data set that you bring in. So for example, if you bring in lab results and then you layer in a registry, you're adding additional information that was not known before. So that's where a statistical certification comes into play, where with all of the linked data sets, we will then obtain a third-party statistical certifier to help us with expert determination to ensure that all of these fields are HIPAA compliant and that we either aggregate to a sufficient level or we remove certain features that make re-identification, that increases the risk of re-identification. So yes, while many different data sources can be linked, ultimately we do obtain a statistical certifier certificate to ensure that this linked asset is still HIPAA compliant with all of these different sources. So what that means is maybe we're not providing data at the zip5 level, we're only aggregating to zip3 as an example in terms of the level of aggregation that's provided.
Thank you. Cool. All right, Ryan, lots more questions around patient consent. So maybe a quadruple click into this. So is there any specific language you've seen sponsors leverage or Datavant has helped sponsors come up with to include in the consent forms? And then there's also a question around if a subject ultimately chooses to opt out of maybe a long-term follow-up, a long-term pulling in of their data, is there a way for you to pull that through in the applications you have?
So on the consent language question, the answer is absolutely yes. It's probably a little difficult to share here in this format. We do have a couple of different working examples. So hopefully in follow-up as we share thanks for attending, you'll have some contact information. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me either on email or LinkedIn. I'd be happy to provide that to anyone listening to this now or in the future. On the can a patient withdrawal, absolutely. So without getting too much into the weeds on this, there's actually the concept of a withdrawal token that gives us the knowledge as we're linking that, hey, this patient has revoked their consent for having a token and participating in the linked data component of a trial. And that certainly can be done. We can enable sites and e-consent and e-clinical organizations to generate those types of tokens that give the linking organization the ability to know that consent was withdrawn. And so we see that. We actually we talk about that more often than we see it actually happen. But obviously, it's good practice for us to make sure that that is available if needed.
Thanks, Ryan. And thank you all for the engagement here with all the questions. So please keep them coming through. I'm going to scan them right now to see if I missed any. Okay, it doesn't look like I missed any. So we'll keep this open for a few more seconds to see if anyone has any additional questions. But again, thank you all for the questions you submitted and your engagement so far. Okay, so I will maybe pass it over to Ivy, Ryan, if you have any parting thoughts, key takeaways that you want to leave the audience with, and then we can close today's conversation. Maybe Ivy, I can start with you if there are any final thoughts you want to share with the audience here, and then Ryan, we can go to you.
Yeah, thank you all for the insightful questions. I'm super excited that we're able to bring this technology to all of us, where we're bringing together real-world data and clinical trial data in a HIPAA-compliant way. As always, I'm more than happy to answer any questions offline through email, and then always happy to set up a call to discuss, how we can do this and different scenarios that you may be running into.
Thank you, Ivy. Ryan?
Echo Ivy's thanks for everyone's engagement and great questions here today. The parting thoughts I'll leave are we're really, really excited jointly by the promise here and by the engagement we've already gotten from sponsors. And I've considered an open door here of, if you have protocols that you think might benefit from tokenization, from linkage to real world data, like what you've heard from the Komodo team today, please don't hesitate to reach out. And we're finding, as everyone on this call knows, like, there's so many different permutations of studies. There's so many different designs. We think there's some really interesting ability to support things like decentralized clinical trials as well. And we're really eager to just take these capabilities out to all different types of study modalities. So we'd just love to continue the conversation offline.
Fantastic, and I echo that as well. And again, I'll remind us all at the top of the call: 64,000 registered clinical trials that are actively recruiting right now. A lot of opportunity to support those trials to really drive for success through this. And what I've been really impressed upon is the partnership with Datavant and how easy it is to really deploy this technology and get very quick insights when linking into the Komodo universe around those patient populations, or patients that look like those patients relative to the patients that were enrolled in that trial, can really unlock a lot. And then obviously that opens up the entire space for deeper analysis. So the ease of the deployment of the technology and the ease of getting to those insights has been very, very, very attractive, and is able to drive to a lot of value with the sponsors we've been able to partner with here. And hopefully all of you on the call will join them with our collaboration as well. So thank you all for your time. I'll pass it over to you, Andy, for closing logistics, but thank you all for joining us today.
Yes, thank you, Kwame. As we wrap up here, I would like to thank the audience for attending and for participating in today's event. I would also like to thank our sponsors, Komodo and Datavant, for making today's educational webcast possible. We would also like to ask everyone in the audience to participate in a brief survey, and this survey will populate automatically after today's presentation has ended. You will receive an email alerting you when this webcast will be available for replay, and we invite you to forward that announcement to your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. Thanks to all for joining once again, and we will see you next time. Goodbye.